right. Well, it's good to see you this morning. Go ahead and grab your Bible. And if you don't have a Bible, there's one there in the pew in front of you. And you can find Genesis chapter 39 there in that pew Bible on page 34. And that's where we'll be today, Genesis chapter 39. I feel like everybody's looking at this TV wondering if it's going to stand up. Are you going to stand there the whole time? Will, are you back there? Just keep your foot right there. Oh, it's an act back there. Okay. Nothing but the best, people. Nothing but the best here at West Jackson Baptist Church. Let's give these guys a hand. All right, okay, all right. If you ever needed your tire changed, these are your guys right here. That was fast. Well, hope you had a good weekend. If you're a guest today, we're so glad you joined us for worship and whatever brought you here. We hope you felt welcome. And this weekend, I got to be a part of the father-son camp out, and I know if you look around, you know who went on the camp out by what's going on under their eyes. Camping is a lot of fun. You learn a lot about the people that you're with, and certainly enjoyed being there with my son. And Rob did a great job leading us in some devotionals as we spent time together. And probably the main thing I think that most of us learned is that we're better off with our wives. When we're there without our wives, with our sons, a lot of things can happen. A lot of bad things can happen. And I started, as I kind of went throughout the weekend, or it was actually just one night, I started thinking, how would this have played out differently if our wives were here? How would this look differently? And one thing that I noticed that would look differently is that we were camping on this little campground. Great, it's beautiful out there. It was right, the Tennessee River was flowing right behind us. But between us and the river, there was a small, I don't know any other way to explain this, Rob, was a small cliff. It was about a 12-foot drop, and it was about 30 feet from our campsite. And then, once again, it was right between us and the river. And I think Rob even mentioned that his wife, Katie, said, hey, on there, they were looking at a picture on the website or something. It's like, does this look like a steep drop to you? And Rob's like, no, it's not a drop, And so, of course, we get there, and it's just straight down 12 feet. And so we're, just waiting for somebody to plummet down the bottom. Nobody did, but I think that would have been different if our wives were there. Other things that were, just small things. At one point, somebody's like, hey, did anybody bring any bug spray? Right? I mean, if our wives were there, we would have had some bug spray. I heard throughout the weekend different guys say, hey, go put on some other shoes. Like it was muddy out there, so the guys would be running around, and they'd get their shoes muddy, and somebody would say, go put on some other shoes. And they were like, these are the only shoes I have, okay? That would have been different if our wives were there. I'm pretty sure my son slept on his air mattress, and put his sleeping bag over him. Like he didn't get in it. He slept on the bare air mattress and used his sleeping bag as a cover. That would have been different. I think we probably had a bed sheet or something on the air mattress if my wife was there. I noticed in the morning when we were gathering to eat breakfast, they made this great breakfast. There were pancakes and bacon, but there were no serving utensils. So we were just grabbing them with our hands, right? Putting them on our plates. There were some hand wipes over here, but I think the package was unopened. I remember my son woke up that morning, and he's like, Dad, why are my hands all dirty? And I said, because you didn't wash them last night. That's why. The same reason your teeth are dirty and the whole body is dirty, because we didn't wash anything last night. I heard guys saying, hey, man, this coffee's not great. My wife usually makes the coffee. Another thing, there was over to one side, there was a kind of a wood structure that the boys had been playing on, and it had been washed up, I guess, from the river, right, that flows through there, washed up on this bank, and the boys were kind of jumping up and running across it. And right before we were getting ready to leave, there was this team challenge down by the river, so we all went down there. And as we got to looking closer at this wood structure, it was bigger than a pallet. It was big, but they were jumping around on it. There were nails protruding up in that thing all over it. It looked like one of those medieval nail beds. You know what I'm saying? There were that many nails sticking out of there. Once again, I think that would have been different if our wives were there. Lots of things. Throughout life, it makes a difference who you're with, doesn't it? People around you impact you. They make a difference in your life. They change things. I remember even there's been opportunities that I've had that I would not have had because of the people that were with me. At one point, we knew a young man who worked down for the Dallas Cowboys, and he worked at the Star, which is their practice facility in Frisco, Texas. And I'm a big Cowboys fan, and so we got to go behind the scenes of their practice facility and see all these things, right? Why were we able to do that? Because he was with us. Another time, I was able to go backstage at a concert and shake Garth Brooks' hand and get my picture taken with Garth Brooks. And I have no idea where that picture is today. I really didn't think it was a big deal at the time, but looking back, it was. And the only reason I was able to do that is because the young man we were with, his dad was in charge of that venue, right? It matters. Who is with you can make a difference in your life, can change things. And this morning, I want to ask you this question. What would your life really look like if you truly believed that the Lord was with you? How would your life be different today, no matter where you may find yourself, if you really had this unshakable confidence that the Lord was with you, that the Lord is for you? This morning, that's what we're going to see in the life of Joseph. We've been tracking his life for the past few weeks. We started off, he had these amazing dreams. The Lord had given him. He boasted about them. His brothers didn't care for them, and so they threw him in a pit. They sold him into slavery. Last week, we took a detour, and we studied about his brother Judah and Tamar. And then now we're going to pick up in the story of Joseph, right where we left off in chapter 37. And he is in Egypt. And so let's read in verse 1, chapter 39. It says, "Now Joseph had been taken to Egypt. An Egyptian named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, and the captain of the guards, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, serving in the household of his Egyptian master. And when his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made everything he did successful, Joseph found favor with his master and became his personal attendant. Potiphar also put him in charge of his household and placed all that he owned under his authority. From the time that he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house because of Joseph. And the Lord's blessing was on all that he owned in his house and in his fields. He left all that he owned under Joseph's authority, and he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome." Let's just stop there for a moment. You get the picture of the emphasis here that the writer, Moses, is trying to convey to us in Joseph's life. It's a good thing when you see phrases repeated in the Bible to underline them, because the author is trying to make a point. And that point is this, that even though Joseph is in Egypt, far away from home, the Lord is with him. And because the Lord is with him, the Lord is blessing him. And because he lives in the house of Potiphar, and once again, we shouldn't get the idea that Joseph's living large here, because he's not. He's still a slave. His life is still not his own. Potiphar was the captain of the guard, so I'm assuming he was a ruthless man. He probably was used to getting his way right in a moment with the crack of a whip or the snap of his fingers. And so we shouldn't have this picture of Potiphar like he was just this great guy to work for. No, he was a man who knew how to be in charge. He was a military man. And he had Joseph as his slave. But even so, we see that in this circumstance, in this situation, that the Lord was with Joseph. And it made a difference. Let's continue to read on. It said that he was a well-built and handsome man. In verse 7, it says, "After some time, his master's wife looked longingly at Joseph and said, 'Sleep with me.' But he refused. 'Look,' he said to his master's wife, 'with me here my master does not concern himself with anything in his house, and he has put all that he owns under my authority. No one in this house is greater than I am. He has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. So how could I do this immense evil? And how could I sin against God?' And although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her. Now one day he went into the house to do his work, and none of the household servants were there. And she grabbed him by his garment and said, 'Sleep with me.' But leaving his garment in her hand, he escaped and ran outside. And when she saw that he had left his garment with her and had run outside, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "my husband brought a Hebrew man to make fools of us. He came to me so he could sleep with me, and I screamed as loud as I could. And when he heard me scream for help, he left his garment beside me and ran outside." She put Joseph's garment beside her until his master came home, and then she told him the same story. "The Hebrew slave you brought to us came to make a fool of me. But when I screamed for help, he left his garment beside me and ran outside. And when his master heard the story, his wife told him, 'These are the things your slave did to me.' He was furious and had him thrown into prison where the king's prisoners were confined. So Joseph was there in prison." What does it mean to say, to believe that the Lord is with you? In every situation, even the hard ones, worse than being enslaved in Egypt is being in a prison in Egypt. Joseph went to having what little freedom he had to having no freedom. As we're going to read in a minute, the psalmist writes that Joseph's feet were in shackles. His neck was in an iron collar. He would have been in some type of dungeon, this enclosed prison with other criminals. Joseph had been once victimized by his brothers and thrown into a pit. Now he's been victimized by this woman, Potiphar's wife, and Joseph is thrown into prison. And for doing what's right. Not for doing the wrong thing, but for doing what's right. And you have to wonder, through all this, as Joseph is locked in this prison, and the Lord, he believed the Lord was in control, right? But was he still with him? Was the Lord still trustworthy? And I want to ask you this morning is, what do you believe? Wherever you may be in life, and certainly this is a little easier when things are going well, right? We can see here in the story what the Lord's blessing looks like when things are going well, right? Things were happening for him, happening for the Egyptian's house he lived in. But what about when things are going poorly? What about when things are really, really hard? When you get up day after day and it's just a struggle. Every day feels like a struggle to survive, and you feel like you're on the outside looking in, whether it be with the relationships or friendships or work or whatever it may be. Maybe it's a physical situation, a struggle that you're in. In those moments, do you still believe that the Lord is trustworthy? Do you still believe that he is with you in those difficult places? Or are you tempted to believe that the Lord has forgotten you or that he is against you? I don't remember one of the main themes that we mentioned a few weeks ago that runs through the Bible, but it runs through specifically, we see it here in the story of Joseph, and it's this truth that God orchestrates our situations to shape us into the people he wants us to be. That God's main purpose in your life, God's plan, right? We all have dreams, and listen, if you have dreams, whatever they may be, okay? We've over and over again, we've said, hey, go for them to the glory of God. But in the end, God doesn't promise to fulfill your dreams, but God is going to fulfill his plan. And his plan for your life is so much more important, right? It may match up with your dreams, but his plan for you is to form and shape you into the image of his Son, Jesus Christ. To ultimately one day for you to be glorified. And so that is his plan. And we can always know that God is using our situations to shape us into the people he wants us to be, into that image of Jesus. And the pits and the prisons we'll see this morning that Joseph's face, and maybe the pits and the prisons that you may find yourself in sometimes in life, are necessary for this to happen, for the God to shape us, to shape you into the person he wants you to be. It's interesting, in Psalm 105, we see a little commentary about what's happening in the life of Joseph here. In Psalm 105, the writer of the psalm is tracing the faithfulness of God from Israel through the life of Abraham. He goes all the way through the time when the Israelites enter into the promised land. And as he's writing this psalm about God's faithfulness, this is what he has to say about Joseph in Psalm 105, verse 16. He says that God called down famine against the land and destroyed the entire food supply, right? That's the famine that we know is coming. But listen, he said, but he had sent a man, Joseph, ahead of them, right, who was sold as a slave. They hurt his feet with shackles. His neck was put in an iron collar. Until the time his prediction came true, the word of the Lord tested him. So as Joseph is waiting in this prison, right, there is a time when his dreams will come true. These dreams that he had predicted, right, based upon the dreams the Lord had given him. There is a time when these dreams are going to come true. But for now, as he's sitting there in this pit, in this prison, with shackles around his arms and a collar of iron around his neck, there's purpose. There's purpose. It's not just a waiting game. Joseph is not just sitting around waiting for the day that he can be used by God. No, God is doing something through his circumstances. God is doing something in Joseph in the prison. The psalmist says that God is testing him. That word test, in other places, it's translated refine. That word refine, like silver. And what are you doing when you're refining silver? You're taking out the impurities. Right? You're using fire, you're testing the metal, seeing what's impure in there, and you're taking it from it. You're taking out the impurities. And once again, this is what the psalmist says that the Lord is doing in these moments in Joseph's life when he is in the pit, in the prison. So the Lord is not absent. No, this isn't some oversight, negligence, right? Oh, I forgot Joseph. Like, you forget your kids somewhere occasionally, right, dads, camping? Won't mention any particular ones, but no, this is not negligence. No, this is the Lord working in his life through his circumstances. And so what is the Lord doing in Joseph's life? I want to just mention two specific things that I think the Lord is bringing about in Joseph's life as a slave in Potiphar's house through these circumstances, even in the prison, through these difficult days in Joseph's life. And the first thing is this: the Lord was shaping Joseph into a humble servant. I believe that through this time, the Lord was shaping Joseph, right? Bringing him to a point where he has to embrace humility. Because he's no longer his own man. He's owned by someone else, right? At one point in Genesis chapter 37, if you were here a few weeks ago, Joseph had this eye. He wanted to be in charge. He wanted to be on top of the world, right? He had these dreams where his family was bowing down to them, and he boasted about them, right? This was his mindset. This is where his life was headed. And he was letting everybody know it. Joseph was all about being the big man, getting the promotion. He was going to be over them. And yet now, where do we see Joseph in chapter 39? Notice even in the very first couple of verses what it says about Joseph, that he had been taken to Egypt, right? He had been bought, right? So he's far from home. He's bought by an Egyptian. He's going to be serving in this Egyptian's household. Joseph is now a slave. Far from being on top of the world, he's on one of the lower ends. Joseph had dreams of being in charge, and yet now he is serving someone else. Someone else is in charge. And not only that, but all the success, right? Because he's a slave, all the success that Joseph is having, who's getting the benefits of that? I mean, he is somewhat, right? But really it's for someone else. All of Joseph's hard work is now benefiting someone else, right? This man's house was prospering. His fields were producing. All this was from the work of Joseph's hands, but it was going to make someone else prosperous, his Egyptian master. And so you could see here in a lot of ways, Joseph could step back and say how unfair this is. But Joseph knew the Lord was with him. Joseph knew the Lord was not absent in this, but he was doing something through this. And that before Joseph could be someone who had people, before he could be in a place of being served, Joseph had to himself learn how to be a servant. And I think that's what we see happening here in Joseph's life. As he's sold into slavery, he's betrayed, right, by his brothers. He trusted, even still, the Lord's presence was with him, and he humbly served. I remember it's been over 20 years ago, and I took a group of college students to Kenya. We flew into Nairobi, and we were going to do host. There was a big missions conference going on there in the city, and we were going to host a camp for the kids of the missionary kids. And so we traveled a couple of hours outside the city. There was a boarding school there, and we had this team of 6 of us, and it was just myself and 5 college students, and then there were probably 40 to 50 missionary kids that were there, and we were to run this camp for them. And so as the leader of the team, I was going to be the camp pastor. I was going to do the teaching and the preaching, and then I was also going to be the director of the camp. And not a big camp, but we wanted to do it well for them. And so we had lined everything up, and they were going to be Bible study leaders and doing rec and those kind of things. And because of all the responsibilities I had, I was going to kind of sleep over in this little special area. The accommodations weren't great, and then the team, they were going to sleep with the kids and kind of take care of their needs. Well, I guess we had been there almost one day, and there was a late addition to the group, and there was this kid named Joel who struggled with muscular dystrophy, and he could barely walk with a walker, but for the most part, it was easier for him to get around in a wheelchair. And in a country like that, they're not built, especially outside the city. There were these huge steps. Everywhere you wanted to go, you had to go up steps or down steps. And because everybody else was kind of locked into already taking care of the other students, well, this completely changed my job description for the week, right? I was no longer I was still camp director and camp pastor, but that came with no perks. The perks were no longer there because now I was going to be tied to Joel, right? I was going to be his hands and feet. And so if I could help him get up the steps, I would. If I needed to carry him up the steps, I would. At night, he would go to bed, and I would help him get his body into the bed, lift his legs up on the bed, and he could take off his socks, but he couldn't put his socks back on. And so he was a great kid, very joyful, in the midst of just his struggles and difficulties. I mean, he was a joy to be around, but still, right? He was still a guy, and Joel would take his socks off every night. He'd lay them by his bed. He kind of took them off where they were kind of inside out. And so I realized the first morning that Joel had only brought 1 pair of socks for that week. And so every morning he would take them off, lay them beside his bed, and then every night, and then every morning I would get up and I had to reach my hand down deep in that tube sock, okay, that he had already worn 3 or 4 times and pull that thing out. That was not how I saw my week going. Joel at night, the bathrooms were a hike away, and so we had to cut up, like a milk gallon in half. And if Joel needed to go use the restroom before he went to bed, he would go in the milk gallon jug. And he would call and let me know, and I'd walk in there and grab it. I would be the guy to have to take it outside and dump it. And I remember our driver, who was a Christian, he was an African man named Vincent. I remember walking outside and getting ready to dump Joel's stuff, right? I'm not trying to be too graphic here, just giving you a picture of how things were going. And I remember looking at Vincent and saying, man, I didn't think I was going to fly halfway around the world to do this, Vincent. All right, this is not how I saw my week going. And I never will forget what Vincent said to me. He just looked me in the eye and he said, God. God. And I feel like saying, Vincent, is that supposed to be profound? Because I'm not finding that profound right now. But it really was. This was no accident. The Lord was trying to teach me something. There was much more I had to learn through serving Joel that week than I did standing up on the platform and teaching and directing camp. And the Lord is teaching Joseph here something. Jesus knew this, right? Jesus, in Matthew chapter 20, verse 26, it says, it must not be like this. He was talking to his disciples who were arguing about who's going to be the greatest. He said, it must not be like this among you. On the contrary, whoever wants to become great among you must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. See, the path to greatness, and I don't care where you apply this truth. I think it's applicable in any area of life, in your home, in school, on the football field, at work, amongst your peers. Listen, the path of greatness, it's not stepping on others, demanding they serve you. It's emptying yourself of your rights and humbly serving others. This is the path of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and this is to be the path of his people. And Joseph is learning this, even though he was unjustly sold into slavery, right? He shouldn't even been there. This wasn't fair. But yet the Lord was using it in his life to teach him how to be a humble servant. And maybe what the Lord has you right now, even though things aren't going exactly the way you would like them to play out. I promise you, listen, let's remember this morning, the Lord is with you. He's using what you're walking through to shape you into the person he desires for you to be. The Lord also is shaping Joseph into a faithful steward, not just a humble servant, but a faithful steward. As Joseph served Potiphar, as you read through the story, things were going well, and so Joseph is promoted. In fact, look at this. Look at his rise up the ladder of success. Verse 4, it says, Joseph found favor with his master and became his personal attendant. Potiphar also put him in charge of his household and placed all that he owned under his authority. And from the time that he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house because of Joseph. The Lord's blessing was on all that he owned in his house and in his fields, and he left all that he owned under Joseph's authority. He did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. So Joseph goes from being this servant who had no position, who had no power, to now he's been given authority. Now Joseph wields power. Now he's been put in charge of the estate, the inside and the outside, to benefit his master. Now he must learn to be, right? He had learned how to be a humble servant. Now he must learn how to be a faithful steward. And you see, he ultimately has this same position on a different scale to Pharaoh, doesn't he? So you can see, now that we know the end of the story, we know where the story's going, but here Joseph has this same position really to Potiphar that one day he's going to have to Pharaoh. But with this new position comes a formidable test in the form of temptation. We said earlier that Joseph was a handsome man. He was well built. And Potiphar, his wife, she noticed. She noticed Joseph. So she calls for him. She demands him. But Joseph refuses. But she won't give up. And as we read through the story, this is ongoing, right? Day after day, she speaks to Joseph. She tempts Joseph. And that's a dangerous place to be, isn't it? Because this was not just a physical temptation, right? To give in physically to this woman. This was a temptation about power and control. I mean, Joseph was the one there in the house who was getting the job done. He was rapidly moving up the chain of command. This would have been a way, and we see this in other places in the scripture, this would have been a way, Joseph sleeping with Potiphar's wife, this would have been a way for him to gain more power. And it's right there for the taking. She's game. She wants to do this. And just think back to Joseph quickly. Remember, at one point he was also, now he's the steward of Potiphar's house, but remember how Joseph chose to steward his dreams. Did he do that well? It's maybe reading too much into it. I don't think that he did. Joseph has the dreams of power, and did he steward those dreams well? No, he didn't. He tried to leverage them, right, to use them to kind of boast in the presence of his brothers. So how will Joseph now in his master's house, how will he use his authority, his position that he's been given? Will he take advantage of it for himself? And we see the answer in verses 8 and 9. It says, but Joseph refused. Look, he said, look, he said to his master's wife, with me here my master does not concern himself with anything in his house. He has put all that he owns under my authority. No one in this house is greater than I am. He has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. So how could I do this immense evil, and how could I sin against God? You know, I'm sure there were a dozen ways that Joseph could have justified this temptation, this sin. A dozen ways he could have minimized and thought, well, this is not a big deal. I mean, look at all that I've gone through. This is, right? I mean, I'm responsible for all of Potiphar's success, aren't I? I mean, don't I deserve this? Shouldn't I have it all? But I love Joseph's response, because in his response we see a glimpse of how we should learn how to deal with this same kind of temptation. And the first thing I would say about this, and listen, temptation will come to us all. But notice what he says about temptation. He says, he calls it sin. He sees what Potiphar is doing here as an enticement to sin. He calls it evil. Now, to be tempted in itself is not necessarily sin, right? We are all tempted. Jesus himself was tempted. But we must be careful how we look at the object of our temptation or what we're tempted to do, because that is sinful. That is sinful. It is evil. And like Joseph, we can be tempted to do something that's evil. In reality, it's evil, but we can often look at it and reshape it and justify it. Make it something other than sin. But when we look at temptation, when you're tempted, listen, we need to be careful that we see it for what it is, an enticement to do evil. Potiphar saw her position, right, or Potiphar's wife saw her position in the household, and she wanted to use her power, right? She was justifying this sin. She didn't see it as evil. She just saw it, hey, I'm in this position, I have the power, why not do it? And some people, that's all they need. They just simply need to be in the position and have the power. If they have the position and the power, then it's okay for them to do. But not Joseph. Joseph believes there is a right and a wrong. He believes there's a good and an evil, and he's going to align his truth, not with his circumstances. He's not making truth relative. No, he's making objective based upon the character of God. The revealed will and the ways of God. And so Joseph looks at this situation. He looks at the temptation, and he certainly had every opportunity to engage Potiphar and Potiphar's wife and to take advantage of the situation for himself and even justify it in some way. Joseph here could have disobeyed God and dishonored him and denied the Lord's work in his life by choosing to call this evil something other than evil. And my friends, I want to be careful. I want to warn you that you don't do the same thing in your life. That you don't look at the temptation to sin and look at that sin and call it something other than evil. Adultery is evil. Sleeping with your girlfriend, sleeping with your girlfriend, sleeping with anyone outside of marriage, using someone physically is evil. Lying is evil. Greed is evil. Gossip is evil. Drunkenness is evil. It may seem like a good time, and it probably is, but it is evil. We need to be careful that we don't look at a sin and call it something other, call it good when God has declared it evil. Pornography is evil. Self-righteousness is evil. And the moment you begin to have a conversation with yourself, calling it something else and minimizing it, you're just getting one step closer and closer to succumbing to it. And I want to remind you this morning, listen, if you're a Christian and you are a faithful steward, you may say, well, Andy, what I'm doing is not bothering anybody. It's not hurting anybody, and I would say you're wrong. It's hurting you. It's probably hurting others in ways that you don't see. But more than that, underlying this truth is that you are a steward. As a Christian, you are a steward of what God has entrusted to you. As a Christian, you've been bought with a price. Your very next breath belongs to God. Your every heartbeat belongs to God. All your gifts and abilities, your time, everything about your life is a gift from God that you've been entrusted with. And so be a faithful steward. And to be a faithful steward in times of temptation, we must be willing to look at temptation and see it for what it is. The second thing we can learn about Joseph dealing with this temptation and him choosing to be a faithful steward is this, is that we must be willing to avoid temptation where it is. Often we try to handle temptation instead of avoiding it, don't we? We give ourselves way too much credit. We think we're stronger than we are. We feel like we can stay in this relationship even though time after time we continue to fall prey to temptation. We feel like we can continue to go to this place, continue to be a part of this activity. And yet we keep stumbling over the same sin over and over and over again. And it's because when it comes to dealing with temptation, my friends, there are some, specifically some, that you need to avoid. You don't need to try to handle it. You need to avoid it. And we see a glimpse of this with Joseph, right? What this temptation tries to do in his life. This is exactly what temptation tries to do in your life. Joseph must have made it a habit to not be in Potiphar's house alone with his wife, because all of a sudden this one day it just happens. And so more than likely this was something Joseph tried to avoid, but one day he's there in the house doing his work. He's a slave. He has to do these things. He cannot not go in the house. He's got to go in the house because he's a slave, right? He's a servant to the master. And so as he's in there, she knows they're alone. And so she grabs him. And she has so tight a hold of Joseph that his garment is ripped off him as he escapes. Joseph can't keep a good coat, can he? I mean, every time he gets a coat, it's gone. She has him so tightly that as he runs away, his garment is ripped off him. In the same way, listen, temptation will try to grab you. Don't be naive. Temptation is an enticement. It lures us, right? It's that conversation you hear going on and you want to be a part of it, but you know you don't need to be a part of it. It's that activity that's going on at this certain place and time, and you want to be a part of it, but you know you don't need to be a part of it, and you have a choice to make. You can either jump in there and say, well, I can handle this, or you can choose what Joseph chooses here, to be a faithful steward of your life, this life that God has given you, and you can choose to avoid it. Especially, listen, when life is hard, when life is tough. I mean, that's the time when we want to justify like sin and doing something we don't need to do, right? When things go badly, when something's unfair, when someone's done something to you and you feel like you deserve better, or your life just hasn't been going in the way that you thought it would, whether it be in your marriage or your work or in a friendship or at school or some type of sport and activity. I mean, the moment we begin to feel sorry for ourselves, we begin to believe this lie that it's okay to indulge ourselves. And yet Joseph here in this moment has every reason to look at his circumstances and look at God and say, God, where are you? You're unfair. But he chooses to believe that God is there with him and that God has orchestrated this situation to do something through him one day and do something in him in the moment. And so he knows he's better off losing the coat on his back and avoiding her than he is trying to get it back and fighting with her. And listen, I'll say this. I know that avoiding temptation, it may cost you something in this world. Students, I know there are going to be some Friday nights to avoid temptation. The option is either to go and try to handle things or to maybe be alone and avoid things. And I want to tell you, it's okay. It's a good and noble thing to avoid something, but I know that doesn't change the fact that it can make you lonely. I know that avoiding things sometimes can cause you to miss out, right? This is the direction everyone else is going. They're going to be, do better in the company. They're going to kind of cut a few corners here. Everybody else is kind of cheating on this, and that just seems to be everybody's doing it, right? And you're going to feel out here, you're going to feel like everything, you're being left behind, and you will be. In that moment, you may pay the cost for choosing to honor and obey God. You even may find yourself in worse shape than you were before. But Genesis chapter 39 tells us, listen, in those moments when you're alone, when you feel forsaken, when life is unfair, when someone else has benefited off throwing you under the bus or lying about you, in those moments, don't forget, you are not alone. The Lord is with you, and the Lord is going to use those moments in your life to shape you into the image of His Son. And my friends, the perfecting of your faith is worth far greater than any treasure this world can give. God orchestrates our situations to shape us into the people He wants us to be. And the second truth, right, the application there is that when we struggle with understanding God's plan, we can trust in His presence. And that's what we see Joseph doing here. He believes the Lord is using this, right? I don't know if he understands this at this point yet or not, but the Lord is using his circumstances and his situation to shape him into the person He's going to use one day. And in the moments when Joseph finds it hard to understand what the Lord is doing, to understand His plan, he still trusts in His presence. In verse 20 ends this way. So Joseph was there in prison, and then verse 21 says this: but the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him. Isn't that good? Joseph's unfairly treated. He's suffering again for doing the right thing. He's beaten down again. I mean, he's so far from his dreams at this point in his life, of everything he thought his life was going to be about. Now he's not a slave, he's in prison. But this one thing is true: the Lord was with him. And there in prison, the Lord was showing His kindness to him. And my prayer will be you'll believe the same thing, that you'll know the same thing in whatever circumstance and situation you find yourself in. Let's pray together. I want to give you a moment, just there in your seat. I want to give you an opportunity to just examine your life. The invitation is often just a good time to have a moment to confess. And so just between you and the Lord in this moment, is there a sin in your life that you're tempted to call good? And maybe you wouldn't say it's good, maybe you know it's bad, but somewhere in your mind and your heart you're believing that's good. And maybe you need to step back and agree with God regarding that sin, to align yourself with His truth and call it evil.